Welcome, I'm Giulia.
And I am Marta.
And this is LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times. Hello there, it's Giulia and welcome to LateMode. It's our 17th episode and I feel we've come a long way already, so I would like to thank you all for taking the time to be with me on this explorative journey. For this episode, I recorded a conversation with Janeen Page, a potter based in Taranaki, New Zealand. Through the alchemy of her locally sourced ceramic glazes, Janeen has been getting closer and closer to the geology of her landscape, using pottery as a bridge between the creative and the functional world of crafts. Guided by the topic of slowness, we explored Janeen's latest project. Inspired by a book wrote in the 1960s, Janeen traveled around Aotearoa for 3 months, documenting and collecting rocks to make glazes. Stay with us to see how we move through deep and slow time, our connection to the earth, and much more. So first of all, I want to tell our listeners where we are. For the past 3 months, I've been here in New Zealand, in Taranaki. We're now recording at Access Radio in New Plymouth. And I just want to give a little introduction on how we met. I mean, I was quite captured by your work, to say the least. I really loved the display when I entered the studio, all the different cups and bowls, and even more knowing the story behind them. In particular, what is it, your latest project, would you say?
I think it's pretty much consumed the last 2 years of my life. But that project started 8 years earlier in my head.
Which is really fascinating. And I think you should introduce it yourself.
So I'm Janeen. Yeah. I'm potter in Taranaki, New Zealand, Aotearoa. And I moved here pregnant. I'm from here, but I came back when I was pregnant. And I didn't plan on staying, but I stayed. And I took up pottery when my kid was about 1 year old. So I've been potting for 18, 20 years now. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Loads of experience.
Yeah. So the project is something that I had bubbling away in the back of my head for a long time. I have used glazes, so the colour that coats the outside of ceramic is a glaze, not clay. So I don't gather clay, but I gathered glaze materials. And Taranaki is somewhere that potters from all over New Zealand came to source this one rock. And it's a marine mudstone. It's 6 million years old and it's full of little critters and animal life that's decayed and settled on the bottom of the ocean. And it makes the perfect glaze material when you fire it in a kiln. And I started thinking, well, what are glazes? They're rocks. And if this is one rock, then what happens if you fire other rocks?
So is this how you came to the book?
Yes. So I went online and I looked up New Zealand rock glazes. And there was one book. It wasn't even really a book. It's a tiny little publication in black and white. And it was published in 1960.
So you found this book. Yep. This book was written by a woman called Minna
Bondi.
And then you essentially set off, based on the book, for this trip around New Zealand to try and recreate these recipes that she had researched in the 60s, but never really documented it in colour even.
There wasn't colour.
Yeah.
When she did it, there wasn't colour and there wasn't roads. So she set off in the 1950s. I think it was family holidays. She'd collect rocks on family holidays and take them back to her house. And she worked with another quite renowned New Zealand potter. And she'd grind the rocks and test them. So the publication in the book that my project was based on was like a collection of, I think there's probably about 80 locations in the book. She obviously worked with the geologists, so she was collecting rocks, she was seeing what those rocks were made of and their composition, like whether they were volcanic or igneous, or well, igneous is volcanic.
You could say whatever, and I would just say yes because I have no idea.
Yeah, I learned a lot about geology. I don't know.
That must have been so fascinating.
It definitely changed my perspective on the environment, how we see time and how we look at the land.
Because essentially those rocks are like layers of time and like big time.
Yeah, they're layers of time, but they're also like, I stopped thinking of geology or the land as linear. It becomes circular because my marine mudstone was a rock and it was many other things before it came to be the marine mudstone, and then it became the land again as the stone. So you start unpacking
very slowly, which is funny enough the topic of today, slowness. We were just discussing before how perfect to have this topic and to really take it slow in this conversation. Talking about, your practice, which I find very fascinating. So when you were telling me the story of how you came to the craft of pottery, even before this project, how you started basically learning from other women here in New Plymouth that passed on this knowledge onto you. And you said you stayed with the same glaze for over 15 years practicing. So I guess that then this project was the way to sort of take all of this accumulated slow process and take it out into this sort of discovery of the country where you're actually based in. And I really liked how you mentioned to me how you see this craft of pottery. Like, what are your motivations to make these objects? Maybe we can go a little bit into that, which I think is a beautiful point to begin with.
What did I tell you?
Well, the materiality of these objects that you make. As you're saying, it's a circular journey of the material.
Which we're part of.
That then ends up in this vessel, in this cup, in this bowl, or even in a decoration if you want. So I don't know if you make anything that it doesn't have sort of functional use.
No, I don't make anything that doesn't have functional use.
And there is a reason for that?
Yeah, I think I've been thinking about this a lot this week because it's been asked to me again. But I suppose I went through art school and, there's always the what is art and the craft debate. I don't know if the art-craft debate is still a valid discussion because it's so merged these days. But I just wanted to rebel against the art world and make useful, functional things. Why can't they be art and be beautiful? But I think my practice is definitely an art practice, whereas my result is a craft. But the basis of my work is an art practice still. I still come at it from an art practice perspective. And I suppose that's all the questioning and the materials and the effect that these objects have on other people is all part of a big discussion. And even the conversations and the drinking of tea and the conversations that are going to happen while people are consuming from these objects is a real big part of it for me.
Yeah, and when you think of glazes, right, because the way that I understand it, tell me if I'm wrong, but the glaze has a very practical function of sealing the clay so that you can then use the object. But then you can also use it as an aesthetic sort of additional thing to the object, right?
Yeah, I think that's even debatable because vitrification is what seals the pot, which is when all the particles are heated so much that they all bond together. So even a pot without glaze would be vitrified, but a glaze is aesthetic, I think, and it definitely makes a pot stronger and it gets rid of that horrible thing if you want to put your teeth against something or your lips against something that is gritty. So I suppose it is an aesthetic function even in that way. Whether it needs to be there is debatable. I think perhaps it happened by accident, glazing because of wood firings. The ash of wood firings becomes a glaze as well.
Yeah. And tell me more about this trip that you did actually.
So the trip around New Zealand?
Yeah.
So in 2000, I set out to... The small publication that I had in my possession for 8 years was in black and white. It had rocks and it had glazed recipes in it, but it didn't have colour photos of the results of these glazes. And in 1950, Minna Bondi had done all this research and the publication had just been kind of forgotten. She was a very different kind of woman in the 1950s. Her husband had a disability, so I think she had to do a lot of the grit and the grunt work around the house and the property. And she passed away feeling like that her work hadn't been seen.
And you know this through her
daughter. Yeah. And so on family holidays, she collected these rocks. I had no other information when I started other than the publication. Mm-hmm. And then I met her daughter, and her daughter filled me in about the family holidays, and they had this little VW Beetle that the kids would argue in the back seat, and Mum was always out collecting all these rocks and bringing them home and crushing them up and making these glazes. And she pretty much surveyed the whole of New Zealand.
That's crazy.
A really long way. So for me, it was about honouring her. It was also about recapturing the image in colour and creating a resource for New Zealand that was accessible, that documented what these potters had done. And the history of New Zealand pottery is fraught really with economics and politics, because we had a first wave of studio pottery in New Zealand in it started in the early 1954, I think the Wellington Pottery Society opened, and went right through into the early 80s, and then there was a political term called Rogernomics that brought in taxes, and we had overseas imports. And so suddenly we were a country that we could order in materials, and the people who were making pottery got heavily taxed. So it became unviable and uneconomic.
Yeah. And you were telling me also a lot of the schools closed down that were teaching these crafts.
Yeah, that's also impacted. A lot of the great New Zealand potters came out of the education system. Mm-hmm. They had to teach pottery in schools.
Yeah.
So they all learnt pottery, and then some of them liked it a bit too much and gave up teaching and became potters. So we have a huge history of studio pottery in New Zealand, and it was very grassroots, a lot of, what did they call it, Kiwi ingenuity. It was like New Zealand...
I heard that before.
Yeah, New Zealand was really isolated as a country, obviously. And we had to invent everything ourselves and have solutions for everything. And pottery was one of these practices where you could get everything you needed in your backyard and create these pieces. And that's what Minna Bondi was doing as a female in the 1950s.
And then so you also told me that you see that now this craft is retaking shape after this period, that you see more and more people involved into pottery or wanting to learn more or even buying pottery again, because it was probably a bit of a bear market for a while.
I think definitely there was cultural cringe around it as well. Like pottery was this kind of weird thing that you had all these awkward pieces of pottery that people would learn to make. And I mean, there's a real art scene of pottery as well. But as a craft, it's debatable, some things that people make.
I think that's in every practice, though.
Yeah. So it's definitely taken off. 18 years ago when I started pottery, people kind of was like, why would you do that? But it was accessible to me as something to study, and I suppose I'd always wanted to do it. But it's definitely taken off, and I would accredit that to Instagram and social media.
Really?
Definitely.
One of the positive things we can finally say about social media.
Yeah. It's a great connection and community and a learning. It's just fascinating. I think people are really fascinated by the alchemy of pottery and how, you're getting these sticky, filthy mess. I think of it as messy. And then suddenly you've got this beautiful, clean, refined product.
Well, I mean, I was going through your blog, which I encourage anyone who's listening now to go to. Actually, I've written it here. It's on your website, which is janeenpage.com, and there is a blog section there. And you documented this trip that we have been talking about, but also there are some posts that are on, the day-to-day methods that you use, and some videos and some photos. And I find it so fascinating to see, you look at these rocks and it's something majestic, and then they turn into this powder, and then all of a sudden it turns into something else. And I think I can clearly see why people would find it fascinating. But I think it also has something to do with, again, today we're talking about slowness. And those crafts, to me, have something to do with slowness in a way.
You've got to be out of your head. You can't be in your head and you can't be thinking about things. It's definitely an embodied practice. Yeah, slowness. I was definitely caught up in the slow food movement, and pottery and the local material side of it was really important to me. Like, my materials it's probably about 30 minutes drive from my home. I don't usually collect wild clay because it's just a big can of worms, really. I purchase New Zealand clay, but I kind of feel that if I'm glazing, why wouldn't I use a material that was so close to my home? That's why I've used it for 15 years, because it's like, if I was to buy materials, they'd come in a white plastic bag from somebody else's backyard. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where that product is coming from, or how it's mined, or the situations in which it's mined. Most of my glazes are on the roadside. They're fallen rocks. I'm gathering. I'm not really digging for materials. Mostly waste products I get from a quarry as well. I get a waste product.
For the glazes?
Yeah. So it's tailings that are left on the floor.
And is it all in Taranaki, in this region, or all over?
The furthest away, I would say, is about 3 hours. But again, I don't make that trip for the sole purpose of getting materials. It's usually if I'm going that way and the material's there, I'll grab it. So the majority is Taranaki glazing because it's really close. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this project, but to me it's really fascinating how was it that all of a sudden you were brought into this geologist position to try and understand all of this through the trip? Was there anything in particular that sort of stood out to you?
Well, we have to mention COVID. You can't not mention COVID. So it was at the beginning of COVID. Creative New Zealand had put out funding for artists to maintain their practice. I had another job in the arts, which had fallen through at the beginning of March 2020. Mm-hmm. And I saw this opportunity come up for the funding, and I knew the project was in my head. It had been in my head for 8 years. So it was a case of I had 6 days to download it out of my head and file the application. And that was what set me on the journey to do it. So I had 3 months of paid work. 1 month of that included travelling around New Zealand to collect all the rocks, and then another month was processing and documenting. So most of the blog I wrote while I was on the road.
It's really nice. I was telling you before, I really liked how you wrote it in this very personal way. It felt a little bit of I'm reading somebody's diary. It was perfect to write it in this way.
Yeah, I'm not a writer and I'm not a blogger, and it was my first one, but I knew that there was a lot of potters interested in what I was doing. I sent a letter out at the beginning of the project to all the pottery societies in New Zealand, because New Zealand has this wealth of club rooms, and maybe we can talk about that too, because that's how I started pottery, was at a club room. And because we do have institutions that teach ceramics, but they weren't accessible to me as a single parent in a small town in New Zealand. I would have had to travel, and I would have had to spend a lot of time online. But I had this very practical resource that was, 5 minutes from my house. And so I had told all the pottery clubs that I was doing this project and notified them, because I wanted to travel around the pottery clubs as well and speak to people who had recipes that were indigenous to New Zealand that they'd been handed on. Because if I'd been in Taranaki and I'd been handed a recipe from a club, there must be other clubs where people were using indigenous materials close to their environment.
With their own recipes.
Yeah, part of the project was collecting these recipes as well.
Okay.
There wasn't many.
No, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was an amazing woman in Christchurch, and she was fabulous because she was 85 at the time, and she was like, Janeen, nobody has ever asked me.
Wow.
Nobody wants to know about what I did with my life, and I haven't had anybody interested that I could share this information with, and I want to tell you everything, you know.
Yeah.
And there's this real generosity with pottery as well, where people, they have spent their lives doing it, and they want to hand on the information and the skills, because they're very tangible skills. You can read a book, but having somebody show you and explain...
It's not the same. I mean, I've seen it with pottery. I have tried it a few times in my life, and I don't know if I could read it off a book, really. You want people to show you, you want to touch the material, you need to feel how it feels, and then they need to sort of look at what you're doing and tell you maybe you're doing this wrong or that wrong. But that's, I think, the beauty about these crafts. And as you were saying to me when we first met, how many things are woven into each object that you make, how many stories of different people, how many traditions have come before this object was made, which I think it's really the greatest thing about handmade objects or about these crafts such as pottery.
I've listened to so many podcasts recently, but I think Martha was saying about how industrialization and machines took away the conversations and the songs of women's work. I was like, oh, of course, that's what happened. Like, so many conversations and cultures were based around these slow craft activities, and we've lost that, you know.
But we're also bringing it back, as you're saying, with your work, with the objects that you want to create, that ultimately are objects that sit around the table, where you do sit down and drink a coffee or a tea or have a meal together. I think that slowly things are coming back, and I do think that we are, in a way, crafting those spaces, like we are demanding them, and when we don't get them, we just take them out ourselves. What this podcast is, you know, it's a way of taking this time away from the busyness of everything and say, like, no, I want to sit down and have a conversation with this person.
Yeah, totally. I noticed that about you when I first met you, is like, the time was different. You weren't rushing off anywhere.
Yeah.
It was really obvious. But I think these things are obvious to us when they're happening. Again, going back to pottery and the handmade, over the years, given pottery to my friend, and their kids just fight over it. Like, they won't eat out of any other bowl but my bowl. And it's like, what are these objects and why are they so attractive to us as objects, the handmade? You know, that children are choosing them over the whiteware or the...
And why do you think?
I just think they have an embodied energy. Whether it's embodied energy or the energy of the materials, and the word energy is kind of a weird one to use, but I think there is something about the handmade that we're attracted to. And whether it's materials or that's so foreign to us in a way, like we've just had so much, I call it white supremacy, white ceramics.
Yeah.
You know, it is.
Just the simple white stuff.
Yeah. You open a cupboard and it's refined. All the impurities have been taken out of white ceramics. It was a real kind of, again, industrialization. Like, you wanted this end result of this product where the imperfections weren't there. And the imperfections in pottery are beautiful and make it stand out from other objects. And the materials that I'm using, the impurities are inherent in the material. So I have flecks of iron through my glazes, and if it was an industrialized process, you'd be wanting to take those out.
And no object will ever be the same as the other one.
Oh, no way.
Each one will be unique as well.
But if you've got an industrialized process, you can't refine that and have a whole lot of items that all look the same. So, of course, industrialization wanted to clean it up, to get rid of the bits of iron or things that would make an object not sellable. Whereas now people are going after the big iron bursts and the iron breaks that happen in pottery.
Yeah, I think exactly this is what we're saying, you know, this demanding, whatever you want to call it, if it's slowness or not, but even in the sort of consumption that we make in buying something, I think if we can choose, we would probably, as you say, buy a handmade object over something that is mass-produced. At least, I don't know, maybe I'm just talking out of my own preference. I don't want to make generalizations.
Yeah, well, it's still got to have function. I think people are very aware of where they're spending their money, and objects have to be functional. And they want to get the amount of use out of them.
Yeah.
So stoneware, pottery. Somebody, when I first made bread pans, they were like, yeah, they last several lifetimes. And I was like, oh, of course. Instead of having this throwaway item where you're using it and it's not fashionable anymore, it's like you buy it because you want it to pass it down to your children. And, stoneware pottery, obviously we're digging it up from, thousands of years ago. It does last if we're looking after it.
And it can continue to carry more stories, which I think, going back, to the craft already embodies all of these previous stories. Then it turns into an object. And if the object lives multiple lives, it continues to carry maybe the family story that you can pass, this object to your kid and just tell them what you were doing with it, and I think it's a great legacy. So I try myself to buy things that are made by makers like you. And I'm a big supporter of this because of these reasons, really.
So the other reason that I have been researching these glazes is because I'm an op shopper. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know if the term op shop is outside of New Zealand. Is it like a thrift shop or
thrift shop, second-hand shop?
Yeah, so in New Zealand we call them op shops.
Yeah.
Opportunities. Lots and lots of opportunities.
Great opportunities. I have to say I love op shops as well.
So I was finding these glazes, and when you've got a cup and you've found it at an op shop and it's got this amazing glaze on it, it's like, how do I know what this is? And then some of the local glazes were showing up. In Taranaki, they show up a lot. And I was like, I'm buying this object, but I don't know where the land has come from that this object has been glazed with. So in a lot of my work, I've named the object after the glaze and which area that comes from in New Zealand. So you've got this reference back. And I think for me, to continue that story of place and knowing where an object came from, we've lost that in that whole industrialization as well. In this global economy of shifting things around, I think bringing people back to, not only is this handmade, it comes from here. And having that respect for materials and place, and knowing that that has come out of the landscape, and that landscape is somebody's home in somebody's area. And obviously we know about mining and, what's happened all over the world with large-scale mining. And ceramics also relies on that industry a lot. So for me, we've got all these displaced objects that we don't know their lineage. And for me, it was like, I came across it trying to find out how to make a glaze. Where do I get this rock from to make this glaze? And I've been tracing back those stories as well.
Do you feel that this practice has connected you more to this place?
Perhaps not to this place, but definitely to geology and how the world changes with, it's so temporary. Like our place in geology is so temporary. If I look at a landscape now, I can see the changes and where we are in the evolution of change. We're so linear as people and as a civilization, or maybe Pākehā civilization is, we think we've got this place and it's going to stay like this forever, but it's in constant flux. So many things are changing. And are they changing slowly or are they changing fast? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's really the question. When you think in geological time, you think, okay, they're changing slowly. But then when you put this time into perspective, as you said, our time is so short by comparison to all of the rest of time that has been before we even started thinking about time.
Totally.
And then it's like, at that point, is it slow or...
In terms of using materials and in terms of consumption, the time that my glaze, obviously there is a lot of this material that I glaze with. It's not something that, it's not rare in the area that I am. It's obviously taken millions of years to get to the point where I can use it as a glaze. And can I say the word mineral? I can't say the word. The minerals.
The minerals.
Mineral. What is the word?
Minerality?
It's like the amount of time and the slowness of this product. Is it a product? It's a raw ingredient. The South Island of New Zealand, 25 million years ago, I want to say 25 million years ago, there's a really great little video online of New Zealand and how it came out of the ocean, because we're technically a very new country.
Yeah.
But only knew that it's come out of the water. But this one material that I use, obviously it's got all the fossilized microfossils in it. And if you look at it under the microscope, you can see all the little critters.
Crazy.
Yeah. And it's just like, well, they had their life. And then all the rock from the Southern Alps and from the South Island, andesitic rock, I think, has all like ground down rivers and flowed down. So you think of that sediment of everything that's ever washed down the river that's ground from a big rock into a final particle of dust, settling on the ocean floor and then rising up to be the mountains that it is in our environment. And those particles make the perfect glazes.
Yeah.
Like the chemistry of them is just bizarre. It's got the stone, it's got the calcium from the little critters, and then it's also, which amazes me, it's exactly the right texture and fineness to make a glaze. So it's powdery substance that just crushes and slakes in water. So,
well, maybe it's again this circularity where everything sort of
Totally.
just circles around and fits into place with each other.
well, we're part of that.
Yeah.
You know, like we're part of that cycle. And I think if we remind ourselves that we're in that cycle, the plate, we're going to talk about.
I really love that quote. Well, I still don't know what the plate actually looks like because I was trying to Google it, but you said it has in 1661 was made.
So it's been a popular internet kind of popping up everywhere for me, but it's a plate that was dug out of a London sewer, and on it in tin oxide, so it's a white plate, and then it's decorated and it says "You and I are Earth," 1661. And as soon as I saw it, it was like, like this awareness of these materials that were being used are the same as the materials that feed us and sustain us. And this whole life cycle that's happening within ceramics is perhaps not slow. Perhaps ceramicists are speeding it up because we're taking a very slow process like volcanic eruption. You've got rocks coming out of volcanoes and then turning into like obsidian, and we're speeding up that process in a kiln. So we're raising the temperature, melting the rocks. But the plate and that reference to us as humans, even like an ash glaze is from plant material. An ash glaze from one tree is going to be different from another tree. And what minerals that tree has consumed in its lifetime gets burnt. Yeah. And then you're left with the actual pure minerals.
Fascinating.
Yes. And that's why the plate, I was just like, it's so good. It's like, just that reminder, because humans need that reminder. It's like this planet is, sustaining us, but we're part of it.
Also, yeah.
And we're just going to be the compost.
Well, I actually saw this exhibition maybe on a magazine or a book where this artist was recreating, I should quote then the name of this artist, but she was recreating these habitats for the perfect, let's say, funeral for humans, so that we would perfectly then decompose and actually become useful compost instead of becoming, more, non-recyclable material or using, coffin or something. And I thought, that's an interesting thought. How can we then rejoin and be part of it again?
Yeah, totally. You can use your body parts as glaze.
Oh,
There's a lot of bone ash glazes. Yeah.
Interesting.
And there's people that have
done that.
Yeah, human bone ash. I don't know, have we stuck to the topic?
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, these topics, they always come and go throughout the conversation. But what we're talking about touches around it, I think, naturally.
Yeah, and going back to that whole timeline of where we are on the timeline, we had a conversation earlier about the AI artist and the change and Jonathan, yeah. It's like everything around us is changing, and I think that's what I love about social media and about the internet is we're seeing that change on a very rapid scale. But really, we're just in one point of a very slow evolution anyway. These things, we are going to witness change in our lifetimes. People, you know, these women that I've worked with, they've witnessed change in their lifetimes, and it does feel like it's going very fast for us. But it also has to happen, and we have to surrender to that process of it.
Probably they felt the same thing, that it was going really fast for them. But how do you see taking craft and sort of passing it on through creating these objects? Like, do you think you are transforming in a way the craft that you learned? What I'm trying to say, are you adding something that is yours to that?
When I was at university, at art school, somebody said something to another person, and it just, you know, when you hear those sayings and you try and unravel them, and I spent a lifetime trying to unravel. This old Māori man had said to my friend, I walk through your mirror backwards. To me, that was verbatim what he said. I walk through your mirror backwards. And I've tried to unravel it of what that actually meant for so long. And I think looking to the past, so there is a Māori proverb in New Zealand that is, you know, we have to look back to go forward, and always keeping the past as part of the future. And I think as a practice with ceramics, I mean, we can't not see our materials as the past. Every ingredient that makes up the plates on your table is some part of this ancient evolution that's created this stone or rock that's ground up to make the plate that you're eating off. All we've done is disassociated ourselves with that process. And I think as far as our impact on the environment, the sooner we start observing that again, and geology again, and the planet again, you know, like I wasn't taught that in schools. Like it's just something that I learned. But geology is just incredible. And yeah, I suppose we talk about fossil fuels and dinosaurs and, you know, like, but everything.
Everything is connected to it.
And everything is on the planet, stays on the planet, and it's not going back anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my other kind of life morals as well is take time out of things, take time out of it. It's like if we, you know, the conversation's rushing, but if we take time out of it, suddenly we're in a different space. It's like we have these time frames that like pressure us into doing all these things. As soon as you take time out of it, everything relaxes. Like even a relationship, you might not see somebody for 6 months and you're fretting. You're like, I'm not going to see you for 6 months. But you know when you see that person again, that 6 months didn't exist.
Or also if you are then worried that you didn't get in touch for 6 months. I have that problem a lot because I'm really bad with communication.
And maybe that's where a lot of anxiety comes from as well, like that pressure to fit in with other people's timeframes. And that's something that I've really come to, back to slowness, is how our perception of time is different as people. Say if you've got a project, it's like, yeah, we're going to paint that room. How long is it going to take you to paint that room? And you're like, oh, it'll take me a day. But that perception of time, of how much you think that's going to take and how much time I think that's going to take, and the reality of how long that takes is like so arbitrary.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, like I perceive that this project's going to take this amount of time. And usually in my head, I think something's going to take longer than it actually does. And I put quite a lot of time aside, but really it's quick. And then I've noticed that other people, they don't put enough time aside and they think that they're going to get a project done fast and it takes them forever.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, one way or another, time does have an influence on us, whether we like it or not. I think subconsciously, this idea that we put this expectations of like durations of something. And it's something that I think we now started doing so naturally. It's like, okay, I think about this action and I already know it's going to be this length of time.
Yeah.
So time is kind of associated to it.
But perception of time, how you internally perceive time, is going to be totally different to how I internally perceive time. I think it's different for everybody.
I wonder how we could come to this middle ground, like if everybody puts in a little bit of their perception together, then we agree on a new set of time rules.
Yeah, I definitely think it would ease a lot of tension in the world, perhaps.
Yeah, and a lot of anxiety and a lot of also misunderstanding, because most of the time, again, it's not about time exactly. It's about other stuff that you have going on in your life. It's not, oh, you didn't want to take the time to return my phone call. Well, no, but I also was, I don't know,
taking the time with somebody else to be present with that person that I was in the flesh with. Yeah.
Time. It's an interesting one coming out of slowness, I think.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask you, when you were talking about the benefits in a way that you experience by thinking about geology or spending time in this kind of environment, researching it, etc. And would you have any suggestion for people who are kind of outside this area?
Well, I think the beauty of what happened for my project was that, and it just happened organically, was that I was in the environment. Mm-hmm. So I had to find the rock to make the glaze. So I went on the same path that Minna Bondi went on in the 1950s, and I went to the areas where she was, knowing that there would be a pink granite in the Buller Gorge. And was like, okay, here's the Buller Gorge. Oh, look, there's a pink rock. Do you think that's the granite? And then like big signs everywhere saying, granite tours or whatever, or towns called Granity.
Must be that one.
Yeah, there's just like that geology is all around us. And when I just did a workshop in Nelson, and it was a excursion. Mm-hmm. So we were going out into the environment to find rocks to make glazes from. And everybody was like, oh, I thought we would be going out to the countryside. And I was like, no, the environment is like, it's still in town, it's in the city. If we look under our feet.
That's the environment, yeah.
Remember? It's just there. And so we actually, one of the glazes that I made in Nelson, I landed in Nelson, and as I was driving out of the airport, I saw this creek, and there was something about this creek, the texture of the sand, that I was like, oh, that looks good. And sure enough, I researched that area, and it was an area that was full of the right geology for what I needed to make glazes. And, this creek was in an industrial area. It was surrounded by, the airport industrial zone. And there's this tiny little creek, and if you jump over the fence, suddenly you're in nature again. And people were like, we thought we'd have to go out to the countryside and we'd have to go, and it's like, no, these materials are still in our cities. They're right there. And obviously you have to have respect when taking materials from certain places. Mm-hmm. On the project that I did, I was taking very small quantities, and when I do my own work, I go and get permissions from the areas that I'm in.
Yeah. I also read on your blog that during your travels, you ended up going to places and even not taking anything there because certain places were, for example, sacred.
Yeah. I think for me, it comes down to common sense and having respect for the history of a place and the stories that are involved that come before. So part of my research into the glazes is not going to these places that are sacred to Māori, that are Department of Conservation land or anywhere like that. My main glazes are very much from the side of the road of a rock that's fallen. And again, I am still using the land, but I will contact the iwi of that area to ask permissions for, the materials. And it's led to some really good conversations. It's led to working in schools. And it's nice for people to know that the environment around them can be used in a certain way and is useful. A big project that I did, I worked with one of the schools down the coast here in Taranaki, and the kids were looking into the material that I use, but they were looking into it for building materials. Mm-hmm. And they were working with a team of scientists to see how strong it was and how much it broke. And so I got to spend like 3 days with these scientists, and that's how we got to look at the microfossils. And, you know, like I learned so much about this material, and that was purely from asking permission to take it in the first place.
That's great.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I like what you're saying. I experiment with this a lot myself, with taking, you know, organic material to make inks and to try to expose them for photographs and all these kind of experiments, I call them, that I do. And for me, this is precisely a way to engage with the environment that it's immediately around me. Because I feel also in this way, we don't have this separation, what you were saying. We are the earth and we're connected to it. So it's like, oh, we take the car, we go over there, we go to the countryside. Oh, finally we're in nature. Finally we're connected to the earth. It's like, no, we're living every day in this place that it's in front of us. And I think those activities or those little specks of time that we take, you know, to spend time with our surrounding really is important to realize that.
But I'd like to argue as well that technology is part of us as well. And
sure,
you know, like it's not separate from who we are, and we can't keep pushing back against going forward either. You know, like mobile phones use and the use of, I'm saying it again, social media, or even however people are listening to this podcast. It's like this evolutionary process. We just have to surrender to it, and we have to acknowledge that it's all part of us.
But it also goes hand in hand. I mean, when I go around, I go for walks researching plants in my neighborhood, and I use a phone app. I use the internet, and I discover so many interesting things, and I love it. I mean, that makes it so interesting in a way that I go back home and I'm like, God, that has this property and I can do this or I can do that with that. And if it wasn't for the internet, I don't know actually how I would find. I could go to the library and I could, but I try to do that here. When I first arrived, I was curious about the local plants here in New Zealand and how I could use them for inks or for antotypes, so this kind of light-sensitive process. And I was at the library and I kind of was looking at just the ferns. I mean, it's impossible. You look at this book and you're like, how there are 320 different ferns in New Zealand and the photos are tiny and they all look the same. I would never be able to recognize which one was edible and which one was which. So it's either really using the internet, taking photos, comparing them, or asking people. I think the most that I learned here was through actually taking walks with people that were very knowledgeable about it.
Totally, yeah. And that's what's so interesting about the project that I did. Like, it wasn't till I was driving through the landscape. Like, there was an area of New Zealand and I was like, how come Bondi did not go to this area where there was so much granite? Because granite is one of the traditional Chinese glaze minerals, or made up of. And then finally, once I was there, I was like, oh, there was no road. She did this in the 1950s. She would have been doing it on dirt roads. She would have done the project or her research without the internet. She didn't have colour photos, so she couldn't reference any books with colour, the pottery books that were arriving into New Zealand. I did a timeline to kind of look at where she was in the 1950s, along with like Bernard Leach in A Potter's Book, which influenced her. She was like, okay, if he's getting these rocks from Japan and the Japanese were getting rocks out of rivers, what happens if I get a rock out of a New Zealand river? So she was going around, but she had geology. She knew about igneous rocks and the fact that volcanic rocks had already melted to a certain degree through volcanics to be suitable for glazes. But she would have had to work alongside a geologist using the old maps. I was like, I had GPS, I had colour photos, I could blog, I could talk to a friend who was a geologist, I could go online and access all the GNS websites, which the GNS website was amazing because they have all these activities. That's our national geology. I think it's the government.
It's the government.
It's the government geologists. But they have all these activities for kids and different areas. And I actually use that probably as my main, I need this rock, trachyte. And then I didn't know what trachyte looked like or where it would be. And then they're like, go to this area and take your kids and you can explore the trachyte cone. And so I went there and saw this rock and saw what it was and then realised it was in different areas. So I was identifying these rocks through the internet.
But this is, again, incorporating our current time with technology, with everything else that we have, taking from the past, which was this book, taking from her story and her research, sort of weave it into your work and put it out into something else. And I'm sure that many people right now are even looking at your website, at your research, and maybe getting inspiration.
Yeah.
Or sort of, finding out something more. You've gone there and documented these glazes in color, so at least now people can see what they look like.
But people didn't know. I didn't know. Well, actually, maybe I did know, that ceramics are from rock. Ceramic glazes are rocks. Mm-hmm. And so the Japanese were working with ashes and ground rocks from the rivers and coating the pots in these materials once they were ground, like building material waste. And then industrialization would have gone, okay, well, what are the minerals in that rock? What is that components? What do they break down to? Calcium, alumina, silica. And it's like, we can take that and we can extract, we can use the straight calcium, the straight alumina, the straight silica, and we can make glazes without you having to have the rock. So the rock would have we'll take out the impurities through this process so that it's been refined and it's been gentrified and it's been all cleaned up. And I think then, obviously, where potters are now, if you start pottery and you go to a club, there'll be a wall full of buckets, and all those buckets have these ridiculous names like Gursley Borat and Cornish stone. I mean, obviously Cornish stone is a stone from Cornwall, but these materials have no meaning to us. And they had no meaning to me. When I walked in there, it was like glazing. Oh, what is that? I don't know what that white bag of powder is, or I don't know what that container is. But through learning the geology and going back to the actual rock and to going and looking in your area of where that substance comes from, I mean, all the people that live in Cornwall must have great access to Cornish stone. But what is Cornish stone and what is it made out of? And what have we got in New Zealand that replicates that? Because this magma that's surfacing from under the earth is surfacing the same way around the world. It's all related. But getting people back in touch with the fact that these materials that they're using are actually earth materials. And what you're eating off is earth materials.
And I think it's also when you get this idea that you should be getting the same results as you're getting in other places, because you will be getting results that are slightly different. And of course, I think that's also what brings us closer to understanding the place where we live has its own habitat as well. That is not, I'm expecting that I should have strawberries all year long.
Totally.
It's like it doesn't happen. So these ideas of expectations that, this aesthetic should be the same, this we should get, it's like, well, we should maybe listen more or accept actually what we can get.
And it's a big part of consumption and consumerism. How long have we got for these phones and these materials that we're using, the peak of everything? I think, when I first started potting, that was definitely a big thing, was peak everything. And I was thinking about all these topics and, it's really hard as a maker to make a consumable, a product that that people are it's just about consumption. It's like, I want those on my table, and for me, it was like if I was going to make an object or make a product, I wanted people to really respect that product and to hold it and to cherish it and to be reminded that it's not a throwaway product. It's not something that next year you'll have the next style. It's like, no, this is like an heirloom that your family's going to hold on to because it's from here. It's close to us. And I just think if that kind of message spread, we would have very different ceramics looking at things in a locality way. Like where you're from, there will be a different type of pottery based on, your location. But again, this comes back to that local food and local resources and...
Stay local.
Yeah. But it has a different form of respect because you have an association with that place. Whereas these objects that we're consuming, it's like they mean nothing to us because they've lost where they're from. They've lost connection with people's hearts, I suppose, in the way of, that place, I've been there. People can hold on to that. Yeah, that's important to me. And it's like it's important to the person where that's coming from too. Their land and their home is important to them.
And how do you see then the sort of global exchange of, we were talking about social media and Instagram and how this is also beneficial in a way to the return to crafts or to the exchanging ideas between different communities. Do you see it opposite to these local ideas that we're discussing?
I think in a certain way, all that you have to be wary of, like if you take care of what's outside your window, and if everybody's doing that, it's like, is this important to me? Does this have my name on it? Okay, I have a mobile phone and I'm using that for my technology. So there's some things that I have surrendered to, and I think there's a lot of things that I've had to surrender values for. Like I'm using gas. I use a gas kiln. I use fossil fuels to fire my pots. And that's not a dirty secret. There's gas down the road from where we are. So I'm kind of like, it's kind of local.
It's local.
It's local
Taranaki gas.
So a lot of money in this town. So, like there's things that I've had to surrender to. And I think as long as I'm thinking about some things, then I can let some things go and allow myself. Because if I had carried on the path, and I think a lot of people carried on this path after the early 2000s and thinking about peak oil and peak everything, we wouldn't be here. And there's a lot of people that aren't here that we're so worried about what's happening. And I think for me, again, geology has, the dinosaurs are feeding this. Where did they go? We're just a very small blink in geology, and that will keep happening. Geology will keep happening. We just might not be a part of it.
So this sort of global connectedness, you just choose to sort of ignore what is not so pressing to you. Is that what you're trying to say?
I'm saying that, no, there's some things that I have had to surrender to. And I think holding on to values and things so tightly, it's like there's change happening that's bigger than we know. We're part of this cycle that's happening and we can't control it. And therefore, why not have fun on TikTok? Yeah. I think there's a beauty and a joy, and that joy is there. And if that joy is what is perpetuating, then that's a great tool. And you can't be a Luddite in this generation of holding back from the future and technology, and but also looking back to the past to know where that comes from. So having respect, but moving forward as well.
I think we covered quite a bit. Slowly, we covered a little bit of ground. Is there anything you wanted to add on taking it slow?
Oh, it's definitely a huge part of my life. If you ask me what has influenced me, it's been to get this life back that I wanted, and meaning I did not want to be part of being in a city. I wanted to have a garden. I wanted to watch the things in my garden grow. Going back to building a studio, that was so that I could just get out of bed in the morning and walk down to a garden and through the garden and make pots. And I listen to podcasts all day. So, just that return to that life that isn't quite so busy. And my life is busy and I'm making, but maybe what I'm making is being made slowly.
Yeah. Well, I can see that it has to be. Not that it has to be. I really feel that it's a type of craft where you have to be present. I don't know if that takes a long time or not, but you really need to be kind of doing it in a mindful way.
Yeah, or just that I want there to be room in the world for the handmade, and if it's going to be here, people have to do it.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's not going to make itself.
No, and I didn't want to lose that place for the handmade in the world, and so I'm a very big advocate for that. And it's so great that people were stitching and knitting and, perhaps they were all doing it, but the fact that it's become so out that people do it, I think it's beautiful, because there needs to be a place in the world for the makers. I feel like, can I mention my child? Sorry. My kid's a maker, and finding out that you're a maker in the world is so important. I think if we allow time for the makers to make, whether it's bread, whether it's stitching, whether it's like there has to be time for the makers to make. Love. Make time for it.
Yeah, that's true. You couldn't have said it better. So how are we going to condense this chat into another topic for our next guest?
The word that has been on my lips for a long time is surrender, and what that means, because I think there's a lot of fighting, not physical fighting, but obviously that's there as well. But I don't know, this surrendering to the slowness, surrendering to the technology, surrendering to what's happening as we watch evolution. It's like we can't control it all. And what do we need control? Yeah, I don't know. Surrender was on my lips.
Yeah, it's been something I have been thinking about as well, especially in relation to time, actually, because it makes me think of my situation in trying to juggle so many different projects and things that I want to make, but also having the realization, well, I have to allocate time and I have to do this and I have to put in my agenda that I have to do that. And then realizing, well, firstly, I don't have all of this time and I need to have my other time, which is not, into this. And then it just comes a point where you surrender to, well, that's it. Like, I can do what I can do. And then everything just turns to be so much better when you just, in your mind, just let it go and be like, well, I want to enjoy what I'm doing. I'm not going to be pushing to make this deadline or that line because I just can't.
I was talking to a friend the other day about chasing these ideals. There's many topics that it happens in, but it's like you've got this point where you want to be and you're kind of like, that's where I want to be. But we're not observing where we are. And if we slow down and we just stop and surrender to that point where we actually are and take a really good look or feel into the situation of where we are and feel into that space, we're actually there. And I think that whole, we've got the Len Lai Centre in New Plymouth, and one of Len Lai's things was individual happiness now. And in that now, and I suppose the now has been talked about in so many different spiritual kind of places, but it's like all it is like just where you are, just surrendering to where you are in that moment and feeling into it. And it's like, it's always good.
Yeah. And most of the time you just have everything that you need.
Yeah.
You don't need to be in the future, this other person. That you are what you are in that moment. And
or just looking out your window and it's like, oh, the birds are having a great time. Like, why am I so stressed? Like there is life going on around us and, there is all these concerns, but...
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I really feel this chat in particular with these topics make me think a lot about the name of this podcast. When we were trying to define what is a late mode, there was really this paradox of being late to modernity, being late to something that hasn't even happened yet, or it has happened before you were here, now you're sort of struggling with it in this present, and like what kind of feelings does that create, of maybe anxiety or maybe not being happy in your own skin. And I think what we discussed part of it is taking time, being slow, having time to make, creating time to make, and also at some point just surrender to what it is that you're doing or to what it is that is happening.
Well, I think the fight, like I was an activist in Melbourne before I came to New Plymouth, and there was, a lot of climate change actions and protests, and in some ways I couldn't sustain that. I had to surrender. I didn't want to move into the future with this anger or this fear or this anxiety. And I think a lot of kids or a lot of these next generations are holding that, like we've created this really fearful place for them. And I just think that so much of the beauty, I hope that they're seeing all the beauty that is in this moment, because we are in this moment. And none of that, it is happening. But yeah, it's a hard one.
Yeah. Well, let's see how the next guest is going to approach surrender. Wow, yeah, thanks a lot for the conversation. I enjoyed it. I will include all links, so I think people should go check out your website and take a look at your work as well.
Thank you. I just love what you guys are doing, and every conversation that I've listened to on the podcast has just been so close to my heart. So I love that this is what...
Thank you.
That you're slowing down to talk.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and the sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.